They said Vera the Hollow-Fanged had never tasted a body she did not finish. In 17 years of war across the Keth expanse, in campaigns that had swallowed whole legions and broken alliances older than most civilizations, the Arathi huntress with the obsidian black fangs had never not once left venom in a wound and walked away. Her bite was not a warning. It was a sentence. The venom of her kind did not simply kill. It dissolved the will first, turned the prey's own nervous system into a betrayer, made dying feel like waking up slowly from a very long dream. Painless, her enemies said, peaceful almost, which, for a people who believed that death in cowardice was the only true death, was the cruelest mercy imaginable. Vera did not offer mercy. She had been told this about herself often enough that she had stopped correcting it. There was a version of her that the war had built, the one the Arathi commanders briefed to new recruits as an example of what a fully realized huntress looked like, and Vera had found it was easier to wear that version than to argue with it. The version was accurate, in most of the ways that mattered for the work she did. The version was economical. The version did not stop in the middle of salt flats to read dead men's letters. Until the day it did. The dropship had gone down 2 days before she found it. She could tell from the oxidation pattern on the plasma-scored hull, and the way the crash debris had been redistributed by the windstorm that had rolled through Morin's Reach on the night of the 14th. She'd been inside her own bivouac during that storm, listening to it tear at the supply lines they'd strung between the rocks, counting the gusts by pitch the way her mother had taught her when she was very young, and they still lived in the coastal territories where storms came off the ocean without warning. 2 days. The wreck had been sitting in the gray salt crust for 2 days, which meant any survivors had either been recovered already or had died in the first 12 hours. She approached from the upwind side, which was a habit she'd had since her first deployment. You smelled a crash site before you saw it clearly, and the smell told you things the visual couldn't. Fuel, and ionized metal, and the particular flat chemical note of burned electronics, and underneath all of that, fainter, the organic signatures that a huntress's nose could parse in ways that no scanner had ever quite replicated. She was parsing them now, walking in across the salt crust at a steady pace, with her secondary claws extended and her primary hands loose at her sides. Confederate dropship, forward assault configuration. She'd seen enough of them burning to know the silhouette. The FAV drops were the ones that had cost the Arathi third flank so much in the first year of the campaign. Heavily armored, fast, designed to punch through defensive grids at low altitude and deliver a fire team directly into the contested zone before the defenders could re-establish position. The humans in those drops were not conscripts. They were the best-trained soldiers the Confederation fielded, and they knew it, and they fought like people who had been told that knowing it was not enough, and that they had to prove it every time. Vera did not enjoy fighting them. This was a relatively recent discovery. For most of her career she had been indifferent to whom she fought. The Arathi served the Compact. The Compact had enemies. The enemies were the enemies, and the particular shape of their biology or their tactics was just a variable to be accounted for. The humans were not especially different from the other variables. They bled in a way her sensors could track. They communicated in patterns her intelligence units had decoded within the first 6 months. They were faster than they looked and slower than they thought, in roughly equal measure, and their adaptability, the thing the commanders kept warning about, was real but not unlimited. You could adapt to a thing you could recognize. The things you couldn't recognize were the things that got you. Vera had decided, somewhere in the second year of the campaign, that the thing she hadn't recognized about the humans was something she didn't have a clean word for. Not their tactics, not their biology, something underneath those things. She was thinking about this. In the flat, automatic way she thought about things while her body moved through a sweep pattern, when she came around the largest piece of the hull section and found him. He was on his back. His chest armor had been breached on the left side, plasma scoring, probably a boarding exchange, which meant the ship had not crashed by accident, and the wound beneath was deep. He was breathing. Barely. His eyes were closed, and his lips were moving in a way that had no sound behind it. And Vera stood over him for a long moment, trying to decide whether he was praying or hallucinating or something that her people would have called the speaking of a half-closed door. The words that came out of a person when they were in the threshold between and trying to hold on to something. Then she saw what was in his hand. It was a sheet of something. Not a tactical display, not a weapon, not a field med kit. Paper. Actual pressed fiber paper, which her intelligence briefings had noted humans still used for certain purposes. Personal ones. The paper was crumpled and stained at the edges, and he was holding it against his chest with the arm that still worked, like something he intended to take with him wherever he was going. Vera stared at it for a long moment. She had killed enough soldiers to recognize last things. The flask a man drank from before a charge. The photograph tucked inside a helmet. The small carved stone that someone pressed into a fist as they bled out. The compact mirror that a woman she'd tracked across 3 kilometers of ash terrain had spent her final seconds looking into, not in vanity, but in the particular human way of confirming one's own face when no one else was available to confirm it for them. Vera had seen all of these things. She had never thought much about them, except as additional confirmation that the species she faced did not handle mortality with grace. She reached down and pulled the paper from his hand. He didn't fight her. His grip was already too weak, but his lips stopped moving and his eyes opened, gray eyes, the color of the salt flats she was standing on, and he looked up at her with an expression she had seen before but never quite placed. Not fear, not defiance. Something tired and dry and used up that might have been, in better circumstances, the beginning of a joke. "You're real," he said. Not a question, more like something he was verifying aloud for his own records. "I am," Vera said in his language. She spoke it well. She had been on this front long enough to need to. "Good," he said. "I thought you might be the fever." She unfolded the paper. She read it standing over him, in the thin gray light of Morin's Reach, with the wind cutting across the flats and the distant sound of Confederate salvage drones beginning their grid search somewhere to the northeast. She should not have read it. She had no reason to. The tactical value of a personal letter was 0, and she had an extraction window that was closing, and the salvage drones would find her position within 40 minutes if she stayed still. She read it anyway. It was addressed to a child, a daughter by the tone of it. The man called her Mo*, which was either a nickname or a Confederation naming convention Vera wasn't familiar with, and the letter was not about the war. It mentioned the war only once, sideways, in a line that read, "I know you've heard things. Whatever you heard, the truth is simpler. I went because someone had to, and I didn't want it to be someone who had more to lose than me." After that, it talked about a lake. A specific lake with a name Vera didn't recognize in a place called the Kareth Lowlands, which she knew from maps as a human agricultural region, temperate, low population density, largely untouched by the current campaign. He described the lake in a way that suggested he had looked at it many times. He described the way the light hit the water in the morning, before anyone else was awake, when it looked like the surface was on fire from underneath. He told his daughter to go there and stand in that light if she ever needed to feel like the world was bigger than whatever was hurting her. He told her the fish in that lake were extraordinary fighters for their size. He told her that there was a particular tree on the eastern bank that leaned over the water at a 45-degree angle and had been leaning that way since before he was born and had never fallen, and that whenever things felt like they were going to fall apart, he thought about that tree. He didn't tell her he was dying. He just wrote it like a man who was describing things he wanted someone else to hold onto. At the bottom, in handwriting that had gotten smaller and less even as the letter went on, a man writing with a shaking hand, slowing down, fighting, it said, "I'm sorry I can't be there to show you. You'll have to find it yourself. But you'll know it when you see it. You've always been better at seeing things than me. Vera stood in the wind and the cold and looked at the letter for a long moment. She had read intercepted communications before, decoded messages, tactical orders, supply requisitions, the dry official language of a military machine running the mathematics of war. She had occasionally read more personal material. The intelligence branch collected it. Personal communications were a resource. You learned a population's pressure points by reading what they said to each other when they thought no one was watching. She had read those without much response. They were data. They were the topology of an enemy, and you studied topology to understand the terrain and the terrain to understand the fight. This was not that. She could not have said precisely what it was instead. She knew only that she had been standing here for 90 seconds longer than she had intended to, and that her extraction window had narrowed by 90 seconds, and that she was still reading the last line at the bottom of the letter rather than moving. You've always been better at seeing things than me. She folded the paper along its original creases and placed it back in his hand and closed his fingers around it. He let her. His grip, she noticed, was slightly stronger than it had been 3 minutes ago. Not much, but enough. She stood up and turned away. Took 3 steps toward the ridge. Stopped. In 17 years, she had never not once walked away from a wounded enemy without finishing it. The logic was clean. A finished enemy could not heal, could not report, could not call for extraction, could not be recovered by his own people and returned to the fight. Every soldier she had left alive was a future problem. Every soldier she had left alive was a letter she hadn't finished writing. The man on the ground was not going to heal, not without intervention. The wound in his chest was deep enough that even with a field kit and full medical support, he was a significant probability of death before any Confederate salvage team reached him. Without intervention, he was a certainty. The venom would be the merciful end, the easy end, the end her people approved of, the end that would carry him out on something like a long exhale and deliver him to whatever the humans believed came after. She had delivered many soldiers to that. She had never found it troubling. She found, standing on the salt flat 3 steps from the ridge, that she was troubled. She turned back. She crouched down next to him. He watched her do it with the same focused, tired attention. No fear in his face, no hope either, just attention, like he had decided that whatever she was going to do was simply the next thing that was going to happen, and he intended to observe it clearly. There was something in that she recognized, not courage exactly, not resignation either. The thing a person had when they had been reduced to the barest version of themselves, when everything that wasn't essential had been stripped away, and what was left was just the willingness to be present for whatever came next. Her people had a word for that. It was the same word they used for the state of a huntress in the instant before a strike, the moment when everything that was not the task had gone quiet. The humans had gotten there from a different direction, from weakness rather than readiness, but they had gotten there. "This is going to hurt," Vera said. "Most things do," he said. Her name for herself in Arathi, translated roughly as asterisk, the one whose bite opens doors. The Arathi had a concept, difficult to explain in Confederate standard, though she'd tried a few times to put it into words for the 1 or 2 people she'd ever trusted enough to try with, for the kind of pain that broke something open so that something else could get in. Not cruelty, not punishment. The specific, surgical application of something that hurt, in order to make space for something that healed. Her people had built an entire branch of medicine around it, though that branch had been mostly disused in the current era, because the war had made everyone's medicine more concerned with endings than openings. She had always thought of it as a hunting technique rather than a medical one. But the distinction, she had come to understand over 17 years, was something her culture had invented and the universe had not confirmed. She bit him on the inside of his left forearm, where the major vein ran close to the surface. A precise bite, The amount mattered more than the location. The location was just access. The amount was everything. And she felt the double compound release in the way she always felt it. The clean chemical certainty of something that knew exactly what it was supposed to do. He made a sound. Not a scream, the pain was wrong for screaming, too deep and too immediate, the kind of thing that hit before the nerves had finished registering, but a hard, involuntary exhale like someone who had been struck without warning. His whole body went rigid. Then it went loose. Then it went somewhere in between, which was the correct response, which meant the venom was doing what she needed it to do and not what it usually did. The difference was dosage and intent. Vera had never told anyone, not a commanding officer, not a fellow huntress, not any of the Irathi physicians who had studied her bite in the first years of the war when they'd been trying to understand the mechanism of the longer kills, that the venom her body produced was not a single compound. It was two. The first was the one everyone knew about, the sedative analgesic dissociative cascade that made dying painless and detached and easy, the thing that had earned her the name *hollow-fanged among the humans, because they thought the absence of screaming in her victims meant her bite was hollow of feeling. It wasn't. It was full of the wrong feeling for screaming. The second compound was something her own people barely documented, because the conditions under which it was useful were so narrow that most Irathi never chose to find them. Her mother had known about it. Her grandmother had used it once, on a creature she had hunted for 3 days in the coastal territories, and had come to feel something about by the end of the 3rd day, a feeling her grandmother had never adequately explained, and had died before being asked to explain again. The compound, in small doses, in a living body with enough remaining function, acted as an accelerant on the organism's own repair systems. It didn't heal the wound. It made the body want to heal the wound badly enough to do things bodies shouldn't be able to do. It turned the body's own will, the thing her first compound dissolved, into a lever, and applied that lever to every repair mechanism the organism had, and told all of them to work harder than they were designed to work. It hurt considerably. The hurt was not incidental, it was part of the mechanism, the way the pressure of a door was part of what opened it. Pain was information, and the information this sent was, "You are not done yet." But the man on the ground was already in the neighborhood of dying, and Vera had decided, she was not yet fully certain why, that she was going to give him a reason to want to leave that neighborhood. She worked for 11 minutes. She used the medkit from her own pack to close the chest wound enough to stop the active bleeding. She was not a combat medic. She was a huntress. Her medical training was about how to make things stop, not about how to make them keep going. But she had watched enough field medicine on both sides of the line to understand the rough logic of wound closure, and the kit had enough in it for rough logic. She administered what she could from the kit's contents. She used the second compound twice more, once at the wound site, pressing her fangs in carefully, precisely, the way you pressed a key and not the way you pressed a blade, and once at the base of his neck, where she could feel his pulse stuttering and wanted it to stop stuttering. Each time she bit him, he made the same sound, and each time his body did the same thing, rigid, loose, somewhere in between. And each time she felt, under her hands, the slight but measurable increase in the regularity of his breathing. By the end of 11 minutes, his breathing was not strong, but it was regular. He was looking at her. "I don't understand," he said, "what you just did." "No," Vera agreed. "You could have finished it." "Yes. Why didn't you?" She picked up his letter from where she'd set it on the salt crust beside him and tucked it carefully into the interior pocket of his chest armor on the right side where the breech wasn't. She fastened the pocket closed. She made sure the closure was secure. She checked it twice, which was not something she had done before for any person, and was aware that she was doing it and continued doing it anyway. "Because," she said, "there is a lake in the Kareth lowlands with a fish in it that I suspect your daughter is going to need your help to catch." He looked at her for a long time. His face was doing something complex and slow, the thing that faces did when the body was too exhausted for quick reactions, but the mind was still processing something it hadn't expected to encounter. She had seen it on dying soldiers before, but on dying soldiers it always went in the direction of whatever they'd been holding onto, the faces of their families, the shapes of things they were leaving. This man's face was going in a different direction. It was going toward her. "That's a strange reason," he said. "I know." "I'll take it," he said. Then he passed out. His name was Corvin Lace. She found his ID tag while he was unconscious and memorized everything on it: rank, serial, unit, blood type, emergency contact. The emergency contact was listed as *Mo Lace, dependent, age 9. She did not examine how this made her feel. She was a huntress. She had things to do. The salvage drones were 40 minutes out. She had time. She moved the wreckage around him. Not to hide him. There was no hiding a downed Confederate dropship on an open salt flat. The crater and the debris field would read on any aerial scan within a 50-kilometer radius. But to create a shelter profile that would read, on drone sensors, as a contained casualty scene rather than an active operative position. Drones triaged. An obvious contained casualty scene got a recovery marker and moved on. An ambiguous scene with heat signatures and movement patterns consistent with a survivor attempting concealment got scrutiny, got a longer hover, got a secondary alert to a tactical team. She had worked with Confederate recovery protocols enough times from the other side to know their logic, and their logic was efficient and impersonal, and she could use it. She moved a large section of fuselage panel to give him shade and wind cover. The wind off the salt flats at this elevation was cold enough, at night, to accelerate the kind of deterioration his body was already fighting, and the second compound she'd put in him would be doing its work harder than it had to if the ambient temperature dropped his core below a certain threshold. She propped the panel at an angle that broke the wind line without blocking the afternoon light, which his body temperature still needed. She placed his weapons at his side, where they would be visible to responders. A wounded soldier who has managed to keep his weapons is a different category of casualty than one who has been disarmed. The first suggests functional capacity, gets triaged higher. She found his field kit, opened, partially used, and laid it out where a medic would see it and understand that the casualty had attempted self-treatment, which would push him up the recovery queue towards someone who would appreciate the effort and accelerate the resources allocated. She did all of this quickly and without sentiment. Then she sat down next to him, with her back against the fuselage, and did not leave. This was, she was aware, a significant decision, not tactically defensible in any framework her commanding officers used, not justifiable in any language she had easy access to. The extraction window she'd been working within was now closed. She had missed her rendezvous by 11 minutes of field medicine and was now adding to that total with every minute she remained on this salt flat. Her unit would log her as delayed or compromised. There would be questions. There would be a debrief, the kind that began with careful language and arrived, eventually, at the real question underneath the careful language, which was, what did you do, and why did you do it, and is the person who did it still someone we can use? Vera was not certain, sitting against the fuselage with the cold salt wind cutting across the flat, that she had clean answers to any of those questions. She sat next to the unconscious man and listened to him breathe, and counted the regularity of each breath, and thought about the letter in his chest pocket. You've always been better at seeing things than me. She thought about her grandmother, who had used the second compound once on a creature she'd hunted for 3 days, and who had never explained why. Vera had been young when her grandmother died, too young to have asked the question that was obvious now. She had only the story told by her mother, who had heard it from her asterisk mother with the particular reverence people reserved for things they didn't entirely understand, and the fact, which her grandmother had apparently considered important enough to pass down, that the creature had lived, that it had healed, that she had watched it go. The Irathi tradition of hunting was not about death. This was something people outside her culture consistently misunderstood. Death was one possible outcome of a hunt. Transformation was another. The bite that opened a door was not a metaphor. Her grandmother had not been speaking metaphorically. The door it opened was real, and what came through it depended entirely on what you put in. And whether what you put in was an ending or a beginning was the whole art of it. Vera had always understood this in the abstract. She was understanding it differently now. His breathing remained regular for the next 6 hours. She checked it at irregular intervals, not obsessively. She was not a person who did anything obsessively. She had disciplined that out of herself a long time ago, but consistently, the way you monitored a thing you were responsible for. The sun crossed the flat gray sky in its low winter arc, and she watched it go and felt the temperature drop as it descended, and adjusted the angle of the fuselage panel twice to maintain his wind cover, and did not think about her commanding officers or her debrief, or any of the official machinery of the war that was waiting for her 3 kilometers north. The salvage drone arrived in 53 minutes, not 40. It swept the site at 300 meters, tagged the wreck in its grid, pinged for Confederate recovery, and departed northeast. Vera watched it from behind the fuselage without moving, and it did not detect her. When it left, she allowed herself a single quiet exhale and went back to watching the man breathe. She thought, while she watched him, about the second compound and what it was doing inside him. She had never used it on a human before. Her grandmother's creature had been a coastal apex predator, cold-blooded, slow metabolism, very different repair architecture from anything warm-blooded. The Irathi physicians who had theorized about the second compound had worked exclusively in models. She was, she supposed, conducting an experiment. The fact that the outcome of the experiment mattered to her in a way that had nothing to do with data was something she noted and set to one side. He came back to consciousness in pieces. First his hands moved, the reflex contractions of a nervous system rebooting, fingers curling against the salt crust. Then his face tightened, the muscles resetting themselves, working through expression before the mind engaged. Then his eyes opened gray and unfocused, and he did the thing she'd noticed before, where he verified reality by stating it. "Still here?" "Yes," she said. He turned his head and found her, processed the fact of her, went through something in his face that she couldn't quite name, but that looked like the adjustment a person made when they had expected to wake up somewhere else and had to recalibrate, not disappointment, not relief, exactly. Something that was both and neither. The recalibration of someone who had resigned themselves to a particular destination and had arrived somewhere unexpected and was trying to decide how they felt about it. "You stayed," he said. "The drones have already passed. Confederate recovery will be here in," she checked her internal sense of elapsed time, 4 to 6 hours. "You need to remain still." "You stayed," he said again, like she hadn't spoken. It was strategically sound. I needed to monitor the drone approach. "You stayed," he said, for the 3rd time, quietly, like he was filing it somewhere, pressing it carefully into the same interior pocket where the letter was. Vera looked away at the flat gray horizon. "How is your breathing?" she asked. "Weird," he said. "Like good, actually, which seems wrong given." He looked down at his chest, at the patched armor, at the evidence of what had happened to him. He took a careful experimental breath, then another. "This seems wrong. My venom has secondary properties that accelerate endogenous repair mechanisms." "Your venom?" "Yes. So you bit me." 3 times. The first was primarily to introduce the sedative compound and reduce your pain threshold enough for me to work. The second and third were the second compound. The dosage is experimental in your species. I don't have reference data. "Experimental," he repeated, "in my species." "Yes." He thought about this for a moment. Am I going to be all right? Your breathing is regular. Your pulse is stronger than it was 6 hours ago. The wound is closed. The recovery team will have better information than I can give you. He nodded slowly. That's a very careful answer. It's an accurate one. I know. He was quiet for a moment. Then I remember all 3 bites. I expect so. I remember the first one felt like being turned inside out. That is an accurate description of the dissociative cascade. It acts on proprioception first, the sense of your own body's location in space. And the other 2. She considered how to describe it, like something trying to remember how to work. He was quiet again. Then, yeah, he said, that's also accurate. He looked at his arm where the bite marks were faint now, faster fading than human wounds because his repair systems were still running hot from the compound. You really didn't have to. No. But you did. Yes. Why? She had been asking herself this for 6 hours. She had produced several answers, most of which were technically defensible, none of which were entirely truthful. The technically defensible ones were about information value, about the possibility of intelligence exchange in a ceasefire context, about the precedent established by demonstrating the second compound's cross-species viability. None of those were why. I read your letter, she said. I know. I thought she stopped, tried again. Among my people we have a word for something that is in the middle of a sentence, something that has not finished what it is trying to say, a breath that is half taken, a door opened half an inch. She paused. You seemed like a sentence that had not finished. He was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was level and careful in the way that voices were when people were working hard to keep them that way. My daughter is 9, he said. I know. She's never caught a fish by herself. I know. He looked up at the gray sky. The clouds were the same color as his eyes and the salt flats and the light, all of it the same flat, exhausted gray, and he looked at it like it was something he was glad to still be looking at. Like he had arrived somewhere unexpected and was taking inventory of everything that was still there. Thank you, he said. I don't have a word for what I'm thanking you for. You don't need one, Vera said. Confederate recovery came in 5 hours and 40 minutes. 2 armored transports, a medical shuttle, 6 armed escorts, a tactical forensics unit because the crash wasn't accidental and someone in the Confederate chain of command wanted to know what had happened. Standard response for a downed Vanguard asset, plus the extra layer that a combat death investigation required. They swept the site with considerably more scrutiny than the drone, which meant Vera had moved a full kilometer to the northeast before they landed, and was watching from the top of a salt formation that gave her clean sight lines and poor cover. She had decided poor cover was acceptable because she wanted to see him loaded onto the medical shuttle before she left. She was aware that this was not a strategic decision. She had decided that was acceptable too. She watched them find him, watched the first scout clear the perimeter and signal the medical team forward, watched the medic drop down next to him and start running scans. Watched the moment when the scan results came back, and the medic did the thing medics did when the results were better than expected. A controlled double take, checking the scanner against the patient, running it again, looking at the patient with the slightly baffled expression of someone reconciling what the instrument was saying with what the evidence suggested should be the case. She was too far to hear anything, but she had watched enough recoveries from enough distances that she could read body language without sound, and the body language here was saying, "This man should be further gone than he is." He was talking to them. She could see his mouth moving. He gestured at one point toward his chest, toward the interior pocket. The medic reached in and retrieved the letter, and she watched him take it and hold it, and something in his face changed in a way that was hard to look at directly, even from a kilometer away. The thing that changed was not small. He held the letter for a long moment. Then he pressed it back against his chest, his own hand this time, and the medic let him. They loaded him onto the shuttle. She watched the shuttle lift. When it was gone, she stood on the salt formation for a few additional seconds, which she did not examine too closely, and then turned back toward her own lines and began the walk north. She did not expect to see him again. The war ground on for another 8 months. The Confederate lines pushed forward in 2 sectors and fell back in 3, and the campaign that everyone had been calling the decisive one revealed itself, as decisive campaigns always did, to be neither decisive nor final, just more expensive than the one before it. Vera was assigned to 4 separate operations over those 8 months, each one discrete, each one taking her to a different part of the front, and she did her work cleanly and without question, and filed her after-action reports and attended her debriefs. The debrief for Morin's Reach had gone as she'd expected. She told a version of the truth: wounded Confederate soldier. Encounter unexpectedly made extraction inadvisable due to drone patterns. No intelligence value extracted. The commander had accepted it with the particular expression of someone who was not entirely satisfied, but had decided that the output of the mission was acceptable enough not to press. Vera had one of the best operational records in the third flank. Commanders did not press people with operational records like hers, unless they had specific and pressing reasons. No one had asked about the bites. The Confederate soldier had presumably not mentioned them, or had mentioned them in terms that led nowhere the Confederation's medical analysis could follow. The second compound left minimal trace in a body that was actively metabolizing it and healing, and by the time he'd reached their medical facilities, the markers would have been within normal parameters. She'd checked the intelligence intercepts as they came in over the following weeks, looking for any flagged biometric reports from Confederate medical that mentioned unusual healing cascades. She found none. She stopped checking at week 6. She had things to do. The ceasefire, when it came in the way ceasefires always did, after the point where everyone had already known it was going to come, and before the point where anyone was ready for the machinery of peace to be harder than the machinery of war. The Morin Accord was signed in a neutral territory hall on a contested station that belonged, technically, to a third party that had spent the entire campaign trying to stay out of it and had mostly succeeded. The Irathi sent 3 delegations. Vera was assigned to one of them, not as a dignitary but as close protection for the primary voice, the senior diplomatic representative, whose physical safety was considered an Irathi national interest, and therefore warranted a huntress who had never lost a principle. She had been in stranger rooms. The hall was large and formal and full of the accumulated weight of what was being ended, which was a weight she could feel in the room even though she was not a person given to feeling the moods of rooms. The Confederate delegation occupied the south side. The Irathi occupied the north. The third-party station representatives occupied the center, as neutral parties always did, with the slightly martyred expression of people who have agreed to a thankless job and are seeing it through. Vera ran her sweep pattern: south wall, east wall, north return, standard interval. She noted the exits, the security postures, the placement of the Confederate protective detail, competent, slightly overstaged, the tell of a unit that was better at field work than at ceremonial environments, who compensated for the unfamiliarity with extra visible presence. She noted the catering staff and the support personnel and the journalists allowed in for the official record. She noted everything, because noticing everything was what she did, and filed it all in the orderly architecture of a mind that had been doing this for 17 years. She was 3/4 through her second sweep pattern when she saw him. He was in Confederate dress uniform, which she wouldn't have recognized from the shape. Confederate dress was entirely different from field kit, and she had only ever seen him in field kit, covered in blood, on a salt flat in the gray, except that she recognized his eyes first. Gray, the color of Morin's Reach in winter. He was standing near the Confederate delegation's secondary table, attached staff rather than lead, the position of a senior field officer assigned to diplomatic duty as a function of his experience rather than his politics. He had a slight favoring of his left side. Not pronounced. She suspected he'd worked hard against it in the months of recovery, the way a person who understood their own body worked against the accommodations it made for damage. But it was there, the body's memory of the wound. He had not seen her yet. She should have kept moving. The sweep pattern existed for a reason, and she had a principle to protect, and the professional thing, the correct thing, the version of her that her commanders had briefed as an example would do, was to complete the pattern and note his presence in her log as a recognized Confederate asset and continue with the evening. She stopped walking. He turned. The moment he saw her, she knew he recognized her, because his face did the exact same thing it had done on the salt flat when he'd woken to find her still there. The recalculation, the adjustment, the look of a person who has expected to arrive somewhere and has arrived somewhere else, and is deciding whether that is a problem. Except this time the adjustment was faster, and the direction it went was different. On the salt flat, it had gone toward uncertainty. Here it went toward something more like the door her grandmother had talked about, swinging open the moment it found who was on the other side. He crossed the room. She should have moved. She stood still. He stopped 3 feet from her, in the middle of a diplomatic signing ceremony with 12 security teams and several hundred witnesses, and looked at her with those gray eyes and said, very quietly in his language, "There's a fish in a lake in the Kareth lowlands that I promised someone I'd help catch." Vera held very still. "You survived," she said. "I did." A pause. "My recovery team said my readings when they found me were," he paused, choosing the word carefully, "medically unusual." "That is a tactful description." "They couldn't explain it." "No, they wouldn't be able to. The field report just said unknown intervention, which is, a slight movement in his face, accurate." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, the room continued its official business, the sound of several hundred people doing significant things, generating the particular ambient noise of an important evening, loud enough that a quiet conversation in a corner was private even in plain sight. "You watched the recovery," he said. "It wasn't a question." "I was in the area." "You stayed until the shuttle lifted." She did not answer this. "I saw you," he said, "half a kilometer northeast on the salt formation." He watched her face. "I didn't tell the recovery team. He stopped, then tried again with the precision of someone who had been thinking about this for a long time and had decided on the exact words. "I wasn't ready to share you yet." "With anyone." Something in the room around her seemed to get quieter, which it had not actually done. The room was the same. She was the same. The change was internal, and she noted it and did not examine it closely. "My daughter caught her first fish last month," he said, "at the lake." Something moved in Vera's chest. She was not entirely certain what to do with it. "Was it an extraordinary fighter?" she asked. "For its size." A hint of something warmer in his face. She threw it back, though, said it was too small to be worth the argument. She said argument. Not fight, argument, she's 9. She meant the fish, but she said argument. A pause that had something in it that was not quite sadness but lived next to sadness, and had borrowed some of its quality, the way a long winter borrowed its light from a sun that was present but distant. She asked about the person who saved me. "What did you tell her?" "I said someone who chose to read a letter and decided it wasn't finished yet." Vera held his gaze. "She drew a picture," he said. "Mo draws constantly, it's always been her thing. She drew a picture of who she thought you were from what I described. She gave it to me before I left for this." He reached into the interior breast pocket of his dress uniform, the same side as the letter she noticed. She noticed everything, and removed a folded square of heavy paper. He unfolded it carefully and held it out. The drawing was in colored pencil, the work of a 9-year-old hand that was practiced and clearly gifted, the kind of gift that was still working out the relationship between what it saw in its head and what it could produce, and getting closer every day. It showed a figure that was female and tall and dark-haired, with something about the eyes and the angle of the jaw that was not quite human, not alien in the way of the visual shorthand, the obvious markers, but alien in some other way, in the way a character could be alien if the artist was 9 years old and brilliant, and working from a description that could not have included much detail, standing over a smaller figure on the ground. The smaller figure's hand was reaching up and the larger figure's hand was reaching down, and they were not quite touching, but they were almost touching, and the space between their hands was the whole space of the drawing, the thing you looked at, the thing the drawing was about. The smaller figure's face was not visible, but the larger figure's face was, and it looked nothing like her. It looked like what a child, working from a father's description on a night when she had been afraid and then less afraid, had invented in the space where she had no information. A woman with fierce eyes and a face that had decided something, standing over her father in the gray, reaching toward him. It looked like what she might have looked like to him. "She got the eyes right," he said quietly. "I don't know how, I don't think I described them, but she got them." Vera looked at the drawing for a long moment. She thought about what it meant that a child who had never met her had drawn her, had thought about her enough to draw her, had decided she was worth the drawing, which, for a 9-year-old, was a form of love that was as serious as any other. "Keep it," Vera said. "I have the original at home." He held it out again. "She made this one for you. She asked me to give it to you. I told her I didn't know if I'd find you. She said," he paused, "she said, you'll know." She said it like it was obvious. Vera took the drawing, held it, looked at the space between the two reaching hands, the not quite touching, the almost. The door opened half an inch, and then folded it carefully along its original creases and placed it inside her own jacket, in the interior pocket over her sternum where she kept the things she intended to carry. "I don't understand your daughter," she said. "Most people don't. I include myself." His voice was warm with it, the particular warmth of a man who is baffled by something he loves completely. "She thinks everyone who does something they didn't have to do deserves to be drawn. She said so once. I don't know where she got it." "That's a strange philosophy." "She's 9, she gets to be strange." The warmth faded slightly into something more considered, more measured. "She wants to meet you. She said so specifically. She wanted me to ask." Vera was quiet. "The war is over," he said. "The accord restricts cross-border movement. I understand that. 3 years minimum before civilian exchange." 14 months, Vera said. "There is a scientific exchange provision that opens at 14 months. It is expected to be broadly interpreted." He was very still. "I know," she said. "I read the preliminary accord language." "So did I," he said quietly. They looked at each other. 3 years minimum on most channels," she said, "but the exchange provision opens in 14 months, he said. "Yes." The pause between them had a particular quality, like the salt flat before the wind came up, like the lake he had described in the morning before anyone was awake, when the surface was lit from underneath. "I want to keep writing the letter," he said. "The one from Morin's Reach. I thought it was the last thing I was going to write. I want," he stopped, chose differently, "I don't want it to be the last thing." "Then don't let it be," Vera said. Something in his face went very quiet, in the way things went quiet when they became certain. 14 months, he said. "Give or take the interpretation of the scientific exchange provision," she said. "I'll write," he said. "The diplomatic channels will allow limited personal correspondence between parties to the accord. I looked it up." "I know you did," she said. "I looked it up as well." The briefest movement in his face, the beginning of something, stopped before it became fully visible. The door again opened half an inch. "Then I'll start a letter." "Then I'll read it," she said. Her rotation was beginning. She could feel it in the rhythm of the room, the slight shift in the evening's weight, the particular moment in a ceremony where the next phase began. She tucked her hand briefly against the interior pocket of her jacket, where the drawing was pressed flat against the steady beat beneath her sternum. He saw her do it. She saw him see her. She inclined her head, not quite an Irathi bow, not quite a Confederate nod, something she made up in the space between the two, in the gap between their vocabularies, in the place where neither of them quite had the words, and stepped back into the sweep pattern. She did not look back. But she counted, as she moved along the east wall, the regular beat of her own pulse, which was slightly faster than baseline, and had been since the moment she'd seen gray eyes across a room full of the people who had spent 8 months trying to kill each other, and were now, improbably, trying something else. She found it was acceptable. More than acceptable. She found that the word she would have used, if she'd had a word for it, would have been something like asterisk beginning. Vera the Hollowfanged had never left venom in a wound she did not finish. This was still true. She had once chosen to put a different thing in, to use the bite not toward ending but toward the opposite of ending. Her grandmother's medicine, disused for a generation, taken off the shelf in a flat gray moment on a salt flat at the edge of the known world, because a man on the ground was holding a letter against his chest like it was the most important thing left in him, and she had read it, and she had decided, in the slow, precise way a huntress made decisions, with everything still and clear, that the thing in the letter was worth more than the ending. She had not understood at the time exactly what the opposite of ending looked like. She was understanding it. Outside, somewhere, beyond the neutral territory station and the treaty tables and the careful architecture of ceasefire, there was a lake in a temperate lowland with a tree on its eastern bank that leaned at 45 degrees over the water and had never fallen. There were fish in it that were extraordinary fighters for their size. There was a 9-year-old girl who had drawn a stranger because her father had come home, and who had said, with the certainty of someone who had not yet learned to hedge against certainty, "You'll know." Vera completed the sweep, took her post at the main entrance, and let the night do its quiet work on the hall around her. She thought about a letter that was not finished. She thought about 14 months, and what could be written in them, and what doors could be opened with them, and what an extraordinary fighter looked like from up close rather than from a distance. She thought that she was going to find out. She put her hand once more, briefly, against the interior pocket of her jacket, felt the drawing there, the paper, the careful colored pencil lines made by a child she had never met who had drawn her anyway. The door was open half an inch. She thought about what it meant to push it further. She thought it was exactly the kind of thing she had never done before and intended, now, to do. The first letter arrived 63 days after the signing. It came through the official diplomatic correspondence channel, which was the only channel open in those early months, and which meant it had been read by at least 4 sets of eyes before it reached her: Confederate intelligence, Irathi intelligence, the neutral station's communications team, and whoever had been assigned to ensure that the provisions of the accord were not being used for tactical exchange. Vera had accounted for this. She suspected he had as well, because the letter contained nothing that any intelligence analyst would find interesting and several things that an intelligence analyst would find confusing. It said, "The lake is frozen this time of year, but Mo says the fish are still there. She started drawing them. She draws them very large. I don't know what that says about how she thinks about fighting, but I'm choosing not to examine it." It said, "I've been thinking about what you said, the word for something in the middle of a sentence. I don't have a word for that in my language. I have phrases, not done yet, unfinished business, midstream. None of them have the weight of what you described, We spend a lot of time naming endings. I'm not sure we've thought as carefully about the middle. It said, I looked up Irathi linguistic scholarship. The university access is limited, but there's a compendium from about 40 years ago. I couldn't read most of it. But the index had a word, I couldn't find its pronunciation guide, that was glossed as the state of a thing that has begun its becoming. I think that's what you meant. I wrote it down. It said, the tree is still leaning. Mo checked on her own last week. She went without telling me, and I found out because she came home with mud on her boots and a drawing of a leaning tree. She said it looked like it was listening to something in the water. At the very bottom where the letter was signed there was a small drawing. Not by him, the lines were clearly made by a different hand, smaller, more confident in its imprecision. A fish, leaping out of the water, disproportionately large. Underneath the fish, in 9-year-old handwriting, this one is worth the argument. Vera's reply took 11 days to compose. Not because she was uncertain of what she wanted to say. She was, in fact, more certain than she had been about most things she had done in her career, which was an unusual sensation, and one she was still calibrating. The 11 days were because she was composing in his language, which she spoke but did not write with the precision she wanted, and she was not willing to let any version of this letter go that she hadn't made exactly what she intended it to be. Her instructor in Confederate Standard, during the early months of the campaign, had told her that the difference between speaking a language and writing it was the difference between visiting a place and living there. Speaking let you navigate. Writing required you to understand the neighborhood, the way the streets were named, and why, the things that were permitted in formal communication and the things that existed only in the informal register, the shortcuts that were acceptable and the shortcuts that were not. She had become, over 3 years, a fluent visitor. She was working, in 11 days, on becoming a resident. She wrote about the second compound. She had not told him everything on the salt flat. She had told him enough for him to understand what she had done, but not the full mechanism, not the history of it, not her grandmother's story. She wrote it now, in as much detail as she could without academic vocabulary she didn't trust herself to translate. She wrote about the coastal predator her grandmother had tracked for 3 days, and about the way her grandmother had described the decision, not in terms of strategy or in terms of mercy, but in terms of asterisk seeing clearly enough to know the difference between a thing that is ending and a thing that is beginning. That was the art of it, her grandmother had said. The compound was just a tool. The art was the seeing. She wrote, I have used the second compound in the field 43 times in 17 years. On prey I have hunted. All 43 were to end. I have been thinking about what it means that the 44th was different, and I have come to the conclusion that the difference was not in the compound. The compound is the same. The difference was what I saw when I read your letter. She wrote, I saw a sentence in the middle of itself. I am familiar with endings. I am less familiar with middles. I am becoming more familiar. She wrote at the end after the closing, the drawing is on my desk, the one Mo made. The fish is very determined looking. I think she understood something about it. She sent it. The exchange that followed over the next 14 months was not, officially, on the record, in any documentation that anyone would have found interesting. A correspondence between 2 people who had met on a salt flat at the edge of a war. It was, officially, a series of communications between an Irathi military attaché participating in the post-accord cultural exchange program and a Confederate Vanguard liaison officer fulfilling his unit's requirement for cross-species communication documentation. Both of them were required by their respective positions to file monthly reports on their cross-border communications. Both of them were aware that they were doing this. Neither of them adjusted anything they wrote because of it. He wrote about Mo. He wrote about her constantly, with the specific focus of a man who had decided that this was the most interesting subject available to him, which was the kind of thing Vera had observed in parents of young children before, but had not previously found interesting. She found now that she did. She found the details of Mo's life, the drawings, the arguments with fish, the mud on the boots, the late-night questions about the war that he answered as honestly as he could to a 9-year-old who was going to know the truth eventually anyway, and deserved to hear it first from him. She found all of it more interesting than most of the tactical intelligence she had processed over 17 years of war. She wrote back about her grandmother, about the coastal territories, about the word her language had for the moment before a hunt when everything went still, the word that looked like readiness from the outside and felt, from the inside, like being very present in a particular place at a particular time and knowing it. She wrote about the second compound and its proper context, which was something her culture had nearly lost because of the war in which she was, apparently, in the process of recovering. She wrote about the Irathi tradition of drawing as a form of record, not portrait drawing in the human sense, but the practice of making an image of something so that you could look at it outside yourself and understand it differently. She said that she thought Mo might be practicing something like this without knowing she was. He wrote back, "She would love that. I'll tell her there's a name for it. She'll want to know the Irathi word." Vera found, when she looked up the specific word, that it was asterisk verata, from the same root as her own name, which meant to open, to reveal, to make visible. She had not known this. She wrote it to him, and he wrote back that he had read it aloud to Mo, and Mo had said, "Of course that's her name. It makes sense." She wrote, "I do not understand your daughter." He wrote, "I know. That's a good sign. The people she makes most sense to are usually 9 years old." The scientific exchange provision opened on a Tuesday. She had not told him in the last letter that she was filing the exchange application. She had not told him that she had researched the Kareth lowlands, the specific region, the climate data, the travel access, the distances from the nearest transit hub. She had not told him that she had checked the lake on the regional mapping system and found it, found the eastern bank, found what was almost certainly the leaning tree, 45 degrees, large and old and still very much leaning, visible even in the survey imagery as something that had decided to lean in one direction and had declined to change its mind. She had not told him any of this because she had wanted to see what he would do with the provision opening, without knowing what she'd already done. His letter came through the new civilian channel 9 hours after the provision opened. It said the fish are thawed. Then, after a pause in the text that she could feel even though it was a letter and pauses in letters were not something you could feel, Mo drew your name this morning. In Irathi. She got it exactly right. I don't know how she knew what it looked like. She said she looked it up, but she's 9 and the academic databases are not typically 9-year-old friendly. I did not ask further questions. Then, the eastern bank of the lake is accessible from the main transit hub in 3.5 hours by regional transport. The leaning tree is in fact still leaning. I have looked at it more times than I can accurately count since I came home. It still has not fallen. Then last, if you were to find yourself in the Kareth lowlands in the next few months, I would like to show you the light on the water in the morning, before anyone else is awake, when it looks like it's on fire from underneath. I would like to show you the fish, which are extraordinary fighters. I would like you to meet Mo, who already knows who you are and who would like to draw you from life rather than description, which she says is the only accurate way. And I would like to keep writing the letter. Corvin. Vera read it twice. Then she went to her desk and looked at the drawing that was on it, the fish, disproportionately large, leaping, with the determined expression that Mo had given it. This one is worth the argument. She thought about what it meant to have been a huntress for 17 years and to find at the end of it that the most precise and intentional thing she had ever done with her bite was also the most unexpected. That the second compound, her grandmother's compound, the disused medicine, the bite that opened rather than closed, had done exactly what it was supposed to do. That the door she had opened on a salt flat on a gray morning was still open. That it had been getting wider one letter at a time for 14 months. She thought about the tree on the eastern bank of the lake that leaned at 45 degrees and had never fallen. She wrote back. She said, "I will arrive on the 14th. I would like to see the light on the water. I would like to meet the fish and assess their fighting capacity firsthand. I would like to meet Mo, who I suspect will be both exactly what I expect and entirely a surprise, which I understand is how the best things tend to be. And I would very much like to keep writing the letter. Vera." She sent it through the civilian channel, which meant no intelligence analysts, which meant 4 fewer sets of eyes, which meant it arrived quickly and directly. She was looking at the fish drawing when the reply came. It was faster than any letter she had received from him in 14 months. It said, "Mo wants to know what color to bring." Vera considered this. She wrote back, "Tell her to bring everything." Outside, the night was doing its quiet work on the world, the way nights did when the world had decided to try something new and was feeling its way through it. Somewhere, in a temperate lowland that she had researched in the mapping system, a tree was leaning 45 degrees over a lake, and the lake was still and lit from underneath by something that was not visible yet but was clearly there. She was going to see it. She was going to stand in that light. And she understood this the way she understood the moment of a hunt when everything went still, when the word in her language that meant the state of a thing that has begun its becoming was the only word that fit. She was going to carry the drawing with her when she did. All of her things, everything she kept in the interior pocket over her heart. The letter still writing. The door still opening. The fish in the lake, waiting to be found worth the argument.